This segment of the Chapter 12 lecture is titled The Origins of Feminism, and the focus question is, what were the diverse sources of the antebellum women's rights movement and its significance? Much of abolitionism's strength was found in Northern women who joined in large numbers. Most were evangelical Protestants, New England Congregationalists, or Quakers who thought that slavery violated Christian belief and practice. The public sphere was open to women in ways that government and party politics were not. They could not vote, but they could circulate petitions, attend meetings, march in parades, and speak in public. Women were active in the temperance movement, building asylums, and other reform campaigns. Women were also critical in campaigns to redeem prostitutes from sin and protect the morality of single women, and they attacked the sexual double standard by identifying men who frequented prostitutes or abused women. Women's participation in abolitionism inspired the early movement for women's rights. In fighting for the rights of slaves, women gained a new understanding of their own subordination in society and law. Angelina and Sarah Grimke, daughters of a South Carolina slaveholder, converted to Quakerism and abolitionism while visiting Philadelphia and began to denounce slavery in public. They had been preceded by Fanny Wright, a Scottish-born follower of Robert Owen, who spoke on communitarianism, slavery, and labor reform in the late 1820s and early 1830s. The Grimke sisters used controversy over their speeches to denounce the idea that it was unfeminine for women to engage in public activity. Male criticism led them to advocate the necessity for sexual equality in all spheres of life. The Grimke sisters were the first to apply the abolitionist doctrine of universal freedom and equality to women's status. Their work and writings helped inspire other women to adopt the standard of women's rights in the early 1840s. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who became key organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention, the Women's Rights Convention of 1848, were anti-slavery activists. They had been barred from abolitionist meetings because of their sex. The Seneca Falls Convention raised the issue of women's suffrage for the first time in American history. The Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, modeled on the Declaration of Independence, added women to Jefferson's proposition that all men are created equal and listed the injuries men had inflicted on women, including denying them the right to vote. The Seneca Falls Convention further denounced an entire social structure that denied women access to education, employment, property and wages, and children in the event of divorce, deprived women of independent legal status when they married, and restricted them to the home. Like abolitionism, temperance, and other reforms, feminism was international, and though it lacked broad backing at home, allies were found abroad. Manufactured goods and domestic servants diminished household chores, and many women chafed at restrictions on their opportunities for gaining an education to enter a profession and exercise talents. Married or not, feminists insisted women deserved the range of individual choices and self-realization that constituted freedom. Margaret Fuller furthered these ideas as a writer, and in 1844 became the first woman to be appointed literary editor of the New York Tribune. She argued that the transcendentalist idea that freedom meant personal development applied to women. Women also insisted on the right to participate in the market revolution. Although women at Seneca Falls were mostly middle class, attendees rejected the notion that the home was women's sphere. Early feminists challenged this idea in a number of ways. Some wore a new style of dress made of loose-fitting tunics and trousers called bloomers, intended to liberate women from the extremely restrictive dresses and corsets that so confined them as to make it impossible for them to engage in much physical activity. While feminism, by calling for rights equal to men, in one sense demanded an expansion of freedom rather than its redefinition, in another sense, feminism challenged prevailing notions of women's innate difference, that women were naturally dependent and irrational, that the world was divided into public and private spheres, and that issues of justice and fairness did not apply to family relations. Feminists used slavery to coin a concept, the slavery of sex, that critiqued all aspects of women's subordination to male authority. While Mary Wollstonecraft had much earlier made an analogy between marriage and slavery, this analogy was spread by abolitionism. Southern defenders of slavery often linked slavery and marriage as natural forms of inequality. Of course, while slavery and marriage were technically different, married women, until the passage of women's property and wage laws around the time of the Civil War, could not own their own property or retain their own wages, which instead accrued to their husband. Inspired by abolitionism, women's rights advocates turned the popular understanding of self-ownership or control over one's person in a new direction. The abolitionists' emphasis on the slave master's violation of the slave woman's body lent a new reality to the ideal of self-ownership for women's rights activists. The law of domestic relations assumed a husband's right of sexual access to his wife and his right to inflict corporal punishment on her. Courts generally did not interfere in cases of physical or sexual abuse unless it was extreme. The issue of women's private freedom showed underlying differences in the women's rights movement. A belief in equality between the sexes and notions of natural differences between men and women coexisted in the movement. Even as some feminists entered the public sphere and challenged aspects of the cult of domesticity, they accepted other dimensions of women's subordination. Even staunch feminists like Susan B. Anthony avoided discussion of women's sexual freedoms in and out of marriage. Yet the gradual decline in birth rates over the course of the 19th century indicates that many women exercised more freedom in their intimate lives. Even in reform circles, the issue of women's rights was very controversial. Abolitionist men who welcomed women's participation typically did not welcome their advocacy of rights for themselves. Disagreement over women's proper role in abolitionist activity sparked a split in abolitionist ranks in 1840. The appointment of a female abolitionist to the Business Committee of the American Anti-Slavery Society caused male abolitionists who believed women should not occupy such a prominent position to form their own rival organization, the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society. Behind the split was a fear among some abolitionists that Garrison's radicalism on issues like women's rights and his refusal to endorse voting or running candidates for office was stunting the movement's growth. To make abolitionism a political movement, these men formed the Liberty Party, whose candidate for president in 1840 received only 1/3 of 1% of the total vote. While the achievement of the goals of the women's rights movement lay far in the future, by 1840 the abolitionist movement had accomplished its most important work. It had spread the message of anti-slavery throughout the North and awakened a broad array of people and groups to the evils of slavery and the necessity of its abolition. The movement's greatest achievement was ending the conspiracy of silence that attempted to maintain national unity by suppressing public debate on slavery.